Hey, everybody, welcome to the Veritas podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of sitting down with Default Friend. She is a writer, podcaster, and commentator talking about all sorts of things that you know I'm interested in, from psychology, politics, culture, to dating, relationships, all of that. So I'm very excited to be speaking with her about that and more. Default Friend, thanks for being with me on the show today.
Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I've been wanting to talk to you for a little while. I would definitely say you're a great Twitter follow, just off the bat. Anyone listening, Default Friend is a really great person to follow on Twitter. You should check her out on there. And I've listened to about half a dozen episodes of After the Orgy, which is your podcast with Personality Girl. And I also would recommend that to my listeners. But just so that people kind of get an idea of who you are if they haven't consumed your content before or seen you before online, could you just talk a little bit about who you are and the kind of content you're creating and why?
Yeah, sure. I guess the best way to identify is as a writer. I write professionally and I write online. Um, and mostly about community, identity, relationships, and those are obviously like very broad topics. More recently, I've been focusing a lot on internet history
Mhm.
and how that intersects and informs how we talk about ourselves.
Yeah, the internet history thing was part of what got me very interested in your content, and this leads really well into the first thing I wanted to talk to you about, which is I talk on this show. You probably saw from checking out my channel maybe before you come on. I am, somebody who's talking about kind of the woke orthodoxy situation, not so much from like the neo-reactionary right standpoint, and also not even so much from like the intellectual dark web standpoint anymore. I'm kind of just doing my own thing, but I'm really interested in the fact that particularly over the course of the past like 6 or 7 years, we've had this woke thing, whatever you want to call it. I kind of just call it the woke orthodoxy, arise and sort of capture the culture in the West. And you posited this theory on Twitter that I saw that I was really interested in. I just wanted to ask if you could kind of talk about it in your own words, where, as I understand it, you've brought into the conversation this idea that where a lot of people are saying that these ideas, these kind of like woke concepts and ideas that have captured our institutions, they didn't incubate and spread so much through academia, but actually through early forms of social media between the years of maybe, let's give it a really broad, say between 2005 and 2015. And you particularly seem to single out Tumblr, which I'm very interested in because I never really was like a Tumblr guy. I know almost nothing about it. So can you talk a little bit about that in your own words?
Yeah. So I do think a lot of these ideas originate in academia, but the mistake is, like James Lindsay, for example. I think like what he puts forward is, sort of like I kind of remember my grandmother saying this sort of thing at some point, like, oh, I sent my son to this college and he came back with all these crazy ideas. But really this thought that like you go to university, you get exposed to queer theory or feminism or critical theory, and you're brainwashed. And then as we have more and more people going through the university system, more and more people are exposed to these ideas, and they colonize corporations and the mainstream culture. um, but I don't really think that's true. I think so. I think he's right to point out that they are academic concepts that have been bastardized and amplified through mainstream culture. But if for anyone who's been in a university setting, even today, these classes, like a queer theory class or a gender studies class or whatever, like they're very small. You could go your whole time in university and not really be exposed to these ideas. And then furthermore, if you think about the evolution of like when we start hearing about these things, it's really coming from the students. It's not coming from the professors. I remember like the first really big issue, maybe actually the first big one was campus rape, but I would not include that in the greater conversation about wokeness, and that's kind of separate. But
Hmm.
maybe like the first really big conversation where it's in the mainstream, it's unfamiliar to us. It's it's a more extreme version of the politically correct culture that we're seeing sort of in the 90s that Peter Thiel wrote about. Is this idea of cultural appropriation, and it's the students who are getting mad at the universities, and often at other students. This isn't my sense is like, this isn't coming from people who took, a class on some, form of social justice, and it was kind of a runaway train, and then they're weaponizing it against the student body. Around this time that these issues start getting amplified, everyone's on Tumblr, which is, I think most importantly, it was very famous for how it helped spread certain activist ideas, but it was even more famous for being a hub for fandom.
Mm-hmm.
And, before Tumblr really, fandom's always been essential to the internet. It was on LiveJournal and DeviantArt and Zanga and all these websites. Even earlier, BBS. It's everywhere. But Tumblr is the first time where like the barrier of entry for fandom is much lower, and it's also one of the most popular websites for teenagers in 2013, and also young adults. So like ages, I think like 15 to 24. Tumblr is the most popular website, and it's and fandom very famously has been a home for misfits, also marginalized people, any sort of identity category that feels that they don't fit into the mainstream. So it's a natural fit for activist rhetoric to become married to fan expression, because it's something that had already been happening. This is just the first time that it has a real platform to spread. So my suspicion is that it's actually much more likely that you are being exposed to new language about gender, or there's like one really famous example is Black Lives Matter actually became a mainstream issue and garnered mainstream support through Tumblr, which is, it's funny that people seem to like, this was written about in the Washington Post and the New York Times, and it was well known. And at the time it was like, look at this great social good that could come from social media, and it was being compared to the organizing that had gone on in the Middle East on Twitter, and it was recognized. So it's really strange to me that now we get, now today we have all these theories like, well, where, how did this happen? And it happened because it's really, Tumblr is mimetic, Twitter is mimetic. It was so easy to get this information, and people started to internalize it. And then even a step further, which is also surprising that I don't see mentioned as often, so today there's this general sort of understanding that Twitter is a place for journalists, and a lot of ideas that incubate on Twitter end up in articles. And that mechanism is very well understood, even if it's rarely verbalized. The same sort of thing was happening on Tumblr. Both journalists had their own Tumblr blogs, and they were pulling ideas. But then at the same time, media sites are decreasing their budgets, and clickbait is really at an all-time high between like 2010, 2014. So you very frequently see the outlets like BuzzFeed and Jezebel take stories from Reddit. I feel like everyone sort of knows about like the Reddit listicle hack for, and then also Tumblr. So even something like demisexuality, which is an ironic sort of in-group thing that makes sense in the language of Tumblr, that gets misinterpreted as a serious identity. And it's happening sort of from two sides, both the journalists who are scraping the internet looking for content that's click-worthy, but then also on the site as it gets reblogged and shared and moves further and further away from its origin point. And I think this thing where this like weird meeting of an obsession with authenticity and then clickbait gets like is very sort of underrated, because if you're not on Tumblr, you may not have been exposed to this, but everyone was reading BuzzFeed, everyone was reading Jezebel, everyone was reading Vice. So it's, if you didn't get it there, you got it from a viral article.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this idea, there's so much to dissect there. We could even talk about this the whole time if we wanted. It strikes me as something that could very well be very important, because what I always try to remind people when we're discussing kind of the rise of these woke ideas, whatever you want to call them. I wish there was a better word for it, but I'll just go with woke, is that we're working with an incredibly short timeline. I mean, it seems like a lot of this stuff has really emerged just over the course of the past 10 years, because as you were saying, yeah, you would maybe be introduced to some of these ideas in academia in the past, but then people would get more conservative as they were older, and they would kind of leave some of these social justice-esque ideas behind in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Then we get to the 2010s. And in the 2010s, what is the obvious culprit for something that kind of was proliferating in the 2010s that could have assisted in the spread of these ideas and helped them sort of incubate and develop in a sort of siloed way, where on Tumblr you have these communities that would appear very bizarre to outsiders, like otherkin communities or pro-anorexia communities. In the 2010s, the most obvious culprit is social media, because I always try to point out to people, from 2005 to 2010, you have the really early social media stuff that was almost exclusive to, as you said, people ages 15 to 24. And then in the early 2010s, it kind of blows up to the point where like your mom is on Facebook, maybe even your grandma is on Facebook. Social media, it's always talked about as this thing that is an immense part of the situation we find ourselves in as a culture. But I think it's actually understated, and that people end up looking to academia, even though the academies, the colleges have existed for ages, and they didn't seem to have this effect in the past. We didn't have a lot of these ideas broadly out there in the culture in the 60s and 70s and 80s, despite the fact that these academic ideas existed at the time and that people may have been learning them.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is that there's the politically correct movement. There's a lot of things that remain sort of at the fringes, and people make a mistake of thinking, and for all I know, I'm the one who's wrong here, but like you were saying, you don't see it as present, right? They make the mistake of thinking that these fringes, just these people, they came of age, they entered leadership positions, and again, like I welcome anyone to correct me, but like my sense is, if you were a grad student in philosophy or whatever, right, gender studies, you go on to stay in academia or stay sort of siloed away. At the same time, you sort of see this overproduction of grad students. And the thing is, they're not just like, their influence isn't like, from school and then everyone, it's sort of like spreading. They're getting online, and that's probably partially how these seeds germinated. So it's like, it's a little bit right, I think. But if you never had people posting it online and getting it to teenagers who are very mimetic by nature, I don't think it ever would have exploded in the same way, because a lot of the people who are probably planting these seeds aren't in leadership positions and don't have the ability to amplify these ideas in any other way.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about the demographics of Tumblr in particular, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that Tumblr was and is not, I actually don't know to what extent it's still really a popular platform. Like I said, it's one of really, Tumblr and Snapchat are two that I've just never used personally. I've pretty much used every other social media. I've even been getting into TikTok lately, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But sorry, there's a siren in my background here that I'm just waiting to pass. So now the siren has passed. I wanted to maybe get into kind of the demographics of Tumblr, because as I understand it, it was a place that was filled almost exclusively with, as you said, kind of the teenager to young adult, like early 20s demographic age-wise. But I also, correct me if I'm wrong, it was very popular with women and girls much more than men.
Yeah, this is the other thing that's been like very striking to me in my research. Most of the people who end up being very active in fandoms and who were very active on Tumblr seem to be women. I put a call out to interview people who were open to talking about it, and I've spoken to an upwards of 50 people at this point, and not a single man or even transmasculine person has reached out to me. It's been
Hmm.
100% women. And yeah, I mean, just no person I've spoken to, I think, identifies as anything other than straightforwardly female.
Yeah, it's funny because I think about the early sort of social media age, kind of what some people would call the golden age of the internet from like 2005 to 2011. And as a male, I was in my I was in my teens during this time. I was born in 95, so I would be like, 10 to 20 years old during this kind of period, or 10 to 16 years old. And I remember as a male, I would go to all of these spaces, whether it's early YouTube or Newgrounds or an Xbox Live chat room, which is a form of the internet, where political incorrectness and sort of edgelordism is the name of the game. Like it's almost this polar opposite. And I wonder how much of kind of the gender gap that we see, especially among younger people in the Western world, where women are generally leaning left, particularly white men are generally leaning right. There are obvious exceptions, but I wonder how much of that is explained by the fact that there used to be this joke that like there's no girls on the internet, but there were girls on the internet. They were just in a totally different place than the men, at least for the first like 5 or so years of kind of the Web 2.0 era.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. I've always taken issue with this sort of mythology that like, and you see this with if you're speaking of edgelords, sort of like edgelord internet personalities like to say that women came online and colonized it, but that's not true because from day one you had pro-anorexia,
Right.
bulletin boards and stuff, and this was led by women. As early as like 1994, you have articles written about exclusively female communities that are presenting like these very bizarre behaviors. There's like a Salon article, I think, and I think it is from 1994, that's about pro-anorexia,
Mm.
and how confusing it is, and how people are very unclear of its origins, and all the strange things that people are doing. Just throughout the history, it's just dotted with these things that are for women, by women, led by women, only interesting to women. I think there's the parts of internet history that people pay the most attention to, or have historically paid most attention to, have been these very masculine spaces, but that doesn't mean that it's always been or has ever exclusively been masculine. I think we really underrate the image of like the female recluse, which is it's really real, like the internet obsessed woman whose whole life is online, in the same way we used to imagine like the fat guy online, right? Like that old stereotypical image, like there was always a female mirror.
Yeah, it reminds me of the episode of South Park where they keep dying because they're being killed in World of Warcraft, and then they show the guy that's killing them, and of course it's this morbidly obese, pimply faced guy, and that was sort of the classic image of the male, mother's basement dwelling internet nerd. And yeah, there is some kind of female equivalent to that, and I think this is really interesting because, like you said, people always talk about how women came and tried to colonize all of the internet. It's like they weren't there at all, and then all of a sudden they rushed in trying to make it all for them. And it's definitely more nuanced than that, because you had young men and young women. It was definitely skewed younger on both ends in the beginning of the Web 2.0 era. But they were on the internet in these separate places, and then eventually there was this incredibly explosive clash. Like the ideas from sort of your Tumblr or blogosphere space and your sort of YouTube and Newgrounds sort of male edgelord space ended up having a really explosive moment circa like 2011, 12, 13-ish, which sort of tracks well with kind of the proliferation of woke ideas. And we first see it in sort of like the clash between the feminist community and the atheist community, for instance, and then like eventually the feminist community and the gaming community. There's just this sort of inevitable powder keg situation that arose.
Yeah. I mean, I will, to circle back a little bit, I do think and it's really hard, especially for me, to engage with these ideas without coming off as maybe like a crypto sexist or something. But I will say, to the credit of like these sort of online misogynists who say, women ruined XYZ spaces, the kernel of truth there is that something like, certain image boards, 4chan, but not just 4chan, or other more traditionally masculine spaces. It's not that the women came and colonized the internet, but they did. There was something that happened where women understood that they had like a certain amount of currency because of their appearance, and could burrow their way into communities that were really about male bonding, even though they had this veneer of like maybe like hostile politics, or discussions that weren't very like girl friendly, for lack of a better way to frame it.
Right.
And I think like that's real, and it's very sensitive, obviously. So you can't really just say like, fuck girls, they ruined it. But I think there's something there that maybe people who are more inclined to speak more diplomatically haven't touched yet. So it's too easily dismissed, which is, I think, like another problem with internet history discussions. Like a lot of the people who we are quick to label as, for example, sexist, have a point. It's just, and it's rooted in truth, but we're a little bit, and we being maybe more mainstream people or more normie people, are hesitant to give them the platform or the spotlight, because it's one, they're I know if I tweeted something like this, I would be attacked in a second, even though I'm agreeing with them. But also it's like it's hard to like reframe it and be like, I wouldn't quite say all women are holes. However, like
not quite.
Right. It's like I wouldn't go that far, but you do have a point about the way these community dynamics sort of unfolded. And it's a shame, because it's like there's so much history that gets lost because it's transmitted, and I think like a purposely hostile way to gatekeep more like normie people out. And I understand why people might do that to keep their spaces safe, but it's too bad, because it would be great if like there was a way to negotiate that sort of rhetoric and pull the true elements out of it, and say like there's really something here. And it's just too bad. I feel like that's a really big problem, like how much more history gets lost because of people don't want to disturb certain dynamics, or they want to keep the history sort of pristine, so they make it inaccessible to outsiders, but they really are saying something really valuable. It's just shrouded in this hard to hard to amplify language.
Yeah, I think you're hinting a little bit at some of the problems that have been exacerbated by the internet and by technology with tribalism, in that people, they see a group that they don't like, maybe with good reason. I mean, I'm not a crypto misogynist manosphere kind of guy, but I've actually had the exact problem you're talking about, where I'm reading some of their stuff and I'm going, some of this is obviously true. Like some of this stuff is self-evident to me, but of course I wouldn't go all the way with the all women are holes kind of language. I'm very not MGTOW. My girlfriend, who I live with, is in the room next door. And there's just this issue where I think people see a person they don't like saying something they might agree with. It makes them really uncomfortable, and then they don't want to even possibly acknowledge that it might be true. And this has come up so many times with the internet. I feel like this was a big thing. I remember when Milo Yiannopoulos was going around, that like I found him at first to just be super entertaining. And then I heard some of the stuff he said, and I found some of it to be utterly ridiculous. And I found some of it to be stuff that I could agree with. And then some of my friends would tell me like, secretly, and I was, by the way, in like the college Democrats, like I was not conservative by any stretch of the imagination, and still aren't really. But I remember my friends would come to me and say like, actually, some of the stuff this guy's saying makes sense, and he is kind of funny, but they couldn't publicly discuss that. But I think a better example, the Milo Yiannopoulos is irrelevant. I think something more interesting maybe would be my relationship to the incel community is what this reminds me of, because I guess technically was, I mean, I don't know. Incel has like a political definition and like a technical definition. I was like by the technical definition of incel, I was one until I was 23. I was like a late in life virgin. And then I lost my virginity at 23. But I never became like fully in agreement with the incel stuff as far as the like hyper misogynistic aspect of it. But I can understand some of the, and I've talked about this on my channel before, some of the frustrations and some of the ideas that they discuss, whether it's hypergamy or whatever, I actually totally understand and might be in agreement with. but of course it's presented in a way that makes them eminently unlikable and that makes them scary. Like nobody wants to go near the incel community. It's very much like a third rail thing. And for me, it's been interesting because as a, I guess what is referred to as an ascended incel, I have these sympathies that come from my personal experience and my deep understanding of their experience, just having gone through it myself. But I totally feel what you're saying about like, it's really hard to ever say like, I found this interesting thing on this subreddit, and then it happens to be like the red pill subreddit, or maybe it's the, I know the Chapo subreddit is gone, but like whatever it might be, people just seem to have a really hard time picking out even good or true, or obviously true ideas just from these sort of third rail spaces.
I mean, yeah, I understand why it's like that. Like incels are actually a really great example because you do see a lot of women who are sympathetic to incels. And sometimes, like there's a great podcast called the Incel Project, which I love and highly like recommend to to anyone listening. But like so sometimes it's like people who mean well, are really trying to understand a topic, and they keep the distance required to out of respect. But then there's also women who see the incel community as maybe an easy target for like attention. And I do think this phenomena of women wanting to farm social media for attention is real, and it's like a support beam to their self-esteem, and it's really hard to talk about without sounding a little bit sexist. And so the violent hostile language that you see in the incel community is to gatekeep women out who might be predators, consciously or subconsciously. And I understand why they do that, because the last thing you want is you have a group of men who are supporting each other in something very painful. Imagine that a beautiful 21-year-old, or maybe just a 21-year-old woman like wanders in, and suddenly it's no longer the dynamic of men supporting men. They're in a desperate situation, and of course there's going to be someone who's a weak link, and it's really hard to talk about because it's cast in all of this sexist language, and it does feel a little bit unfair. But when looked through the lens of not all women do this, but some women do, and they have to protect themselves the only way they know how. Like it's insane to expect them to protect themselves in like a calm, rational way and say, I'm sorry, young lady, but this is men only, and we're supporting one another, and we're doing our own thing. And then they're gonna say like, fuck off, thought, get out of here, and whatever other thing they want to say, or they'll scare her with like an Elliot Rodger meme, or whatever it takes. And I think it's hard to, certainly some of these people are actually violent, but I would imagine that most of them are just putting up a gate just to say like, I need, like, I have no other space in my life where I could vent this pain, and I'm not going to let you take it from me.
Yeah, this gatekeeping mindset and this idea that you would actually be intentionally abrasive to keep out people you don't want. I mean, it speaks to the inherent logic in the fact that, a group is defined not so much by who's included, but by who's excluded. And if no one is excluded, it fails to be a group. But it also speaks to this duality between a gatekeeping mindset and a sort of colonization mindset, which I think is really interesting, because there are groups that just want to be, a lot of support groups are going to be like this. They want to be insulated. They want to be exclusive. But then there are groups that actually want to grow because they have maybe a political agenda or whatever. And I think we've seen kind of a switch in the mindset of the woke orthodoxy in this way, in that for a long time, the mentality there was very much like, it's not my job to educate you. Fuck you, white supremacist. Even if, they're telling you you're white supremacist because you drink whole milk or something, just something ridiculous, or because you don't think there's 80 genders, or whatever it might be. Or maybe you're just asking questions and all of a sudden you're a white supremacist. That would seem to be the attitude up until maybe like 2017, 18, which I don't think is a coincidence. Donald Trump takes office. And And then all of a sudden it became much more kind of seductive in nature. Like it's pulling people in, it's grooming people. TikTok is a space where I've seen this a lot. I'm actually on TikTok. People, by the way, listening can find me on TikTok, Scott Veritas, same name there. But we've sort of seen a switch from that mindset that you were describing, that gatekeeping mindset, to sort of this colonization mindset among the exact sort of woke orthodox cohort that I was referring to earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always actually sort of been both with them. Like, you know, anyone is kind of allowed in, but then they impose a hierarchy very quickly, which I think it's sort of gatekeeping, but I think it's more like you need to know your, like, so like with incels, it's you can't just enter the group. You kind of need to prove your stuff. And then like once you're in the group, I don't actually know what, you know, if there is sort of any hierarchy dynamics. There might be, you know, I don't purport to be any sort of like incel expert or anything, but with like wokeness, I find that they let anyone in, and they've always sort of let anyone in, but then you end up sort of breaking down your identity in smaller and smaller pieces, so a hierarchy emerges, and then people start fighting for their place in that hierarchy. And it's because it's so open, and like the design is sort of to have this like subservient class that's constantly being put in their place. And then if you like really break the rules, then you're shunned, but you kind of need that shunned class to like, you know, to bolster the rest of the hierarchy. So like, I would think of it as like, you have the canceled people at the very bottom, then you have like, you know, you have white people who are sort of constantly like groveling for their, you know, their place, like, I'm sorry for my sins. And then, you know, from there, like you have the rest of like the identity groups, you know, maybe sometimes fighting. And then you have some, you know, one identity category at the top. And I think that's sort of the difference there with like wokeness and maybe, you know, what's on the right, which is a little bit more, it's a little bit more nebulous and a little bit more inviting in a sense.
Yeah, they kind of do both at the same time. One space that I'm really interested in, where the dynamics between different ends of the political spectrum and how they're doing this sort of thing, TikTok, which you've been talking about on Twitter, and I've been very curious because you seem to be one of the only people I can find that is taking TikTok very seriously, and I've also been taking it very seriously, particularly for the past year, in terms of the speed at which it is growing, how influential it is, particularly with people under the age of 21, but even with people under the age of 30 generally. I mean, I'm 26, I'm on TikTok. So I just wanted to ask you about TikTok in particular, since we're kind of talking about social media. Do you think that, tell me about your view of TikTok in terms of its influence on the culture, and then also what you think maybe its future trajectory might be. Like, do you see it as something that could actually surpass Twitter and YouTube as kind of hubs of culture and political discussion in a way?
Yeah, well, first I want to say there's lots of people who are taking TikTok seriously, but they're looking at, I might be one of the only people who's looking at particular trends, but there's been a lot of journalists who have really been fighting to be taken seriously for their TikTok coverage, which I think is very good. They tend to cover, I think I might be the only one who's looking at certain political trends, but they, you know, I think it's very important to cover creator houses and certain influencers and certain, you know, certain other more mainstream accessible trends. And, you know, please forgive this, but I do have to say, like, Taylor Lorenz is doing I don't know about her work in the startup community, which has made her a bit of a firecracker, but her TikTok specific work is really important. And she's done a lot to inspire other journalists who cover digital culture, you know, and to get this sort of, you know, pull this out of the trend or style section and into like, okay, this is actual culture commentary. Tons of people doing that. And also there's a venture capitalist named Nicole Williams, who like years and years and years ago was like, look at this platform, there's something very serious and real happening here. And you know, again, I think maybe I'm alone in talking about like trends about sex and relationships in the way that I'm doing it, but these people, great work. If you like TikTok in general, and not just the specific areas I cover, like, check them out. They're on Twitter. You know, they're doing their own thing, different, but we're both championing the same platform. To answer your question though, I think it's sort of a spiritual successor to Tumblr, especially in how it engages with youth culture. And I think it's already had a huge impact on more mainstream culture. Like if you, so maybe you've noticed this, but I've noticed that when I'm flipping through the car radio or when I'm in a restaurant or a bar, there isn't some explicit theme. The music that I hear is stuff that's trending on TikTok, regardless of when the song came out. It's not just artists that were created via TikTok. It's like, if there is a song from 1963 where 10 seconds of it went viral, I'll hear the full song in a restaurant or bar or whatever. The way we eat, what we eat, what products we buy are super influenced by TikTok. Regularly things are getting, and I haven't been able to find any hard numbers on this, but like, anytime I'm at like Sephora or very, very often at drugstores and super often in the grocery store, stuff is sold out. And there's sometimes even a little sticky note that says, TikTok gummy bears or like whatever thing, sold out. We'll get this back in like 3 weeks. You see this on Amazon all the time, like people selling things sort of like third party, and like they put in the title, like, as seen on TikTok, and there's tons and tons of, like, it's insane, like stuff just flying off the shelves. And my theory is like, if it can push that kind of product adoption, then it could push ideological adoption.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, surely. The influence of it. I'm glad to hear that there are. I'm going to have to look up some of the people you're talking about, those journalists who are covering TikTok, because it's hard to overstate the influence that it's had, particularly over the course of the past like 2 years. There are so many different elements that I think make things from TikTok catch on so quickly. It's incredibly addictive. It is very short form content. It's utterly consumable. It's almost, it's like Tinder without dating. I mean, it's such a like fun game to just go through. I can't believe how addicting it is. I've set a limit of like 30 minutes or so per day on TikTok. I've been able to kind of stick to that personally, but it's the mimetic potential is unbelievable. And I actually didn't know that like there are these items that are selling out. I definitely noticed the music thing. What you said about the influence of TikTok on the music industry is unbelievable. And it seems to have exploded, particularly over the course of the past year. It's this very kind of new and exciting space, and also yet just kind of terrifying, because it seems to be accelerating this process of social media changing the way the world works and doing it a little too quickly for, I think, our society to handle. It's it strikes me as so exciting though, on one hand, because it's like the first really exciting new social media venture that I can think of. I know like Instagram really blew up in like 2012. And then at one point there was Vine, but then Vine died. And then, TikTok comes around, I think in like 2017. And it's kind of like this new thing, whereas social media felt kind of stagnant for a while. I know there was Snapchat, but I don't know anything about Snapchat, so I can't speak on that. But to me, it is hard to overstate its influence. And I think that outside of the people you were discussing, the people who are dismissing it are really doing so at their own peril. And they're going to end up sounding like people who 10 years ago said, like, why would you ever want to be a YouTuber? What's a podcast? Why would you ever want to do a podcast?
Yeah, I think like there's this real sort of dismissive thing of like, well, go touch grass, go, log off. But like, there really is, I'm sort of on the fence about this. Like, on the one hand, I don't think the amount of influence that the digital has on our lives is healthy. But there really, in a sense, there really is no such thing as like logging off, especially for certain career paths. And I think people want to understate the influence because it's so harmful on just your psyche. Like and I've been very open about this. Twitter has like negatively affected my self-esteem like quite. I take every troll seriously, and it's not because, and in a way it's just because I'm not jaded yet. It's just I can't help it. Like I see it as a real attack, even if it might not be. And I think a lot of people are in this boat. You either become numb to it, log off, or you let yourself get hurt by it. And it's, I think because it does have such negative power, we want to understate, the negative power it can hold, and also the positive power. Like the flip side of like Twitter making me feel awful like half the time is like I've also been able to find a platform for my writing, and I've been able to learn a lot and talk to really cool people and make a bunch of really cool friends. But I think that most people feel sort of beholden or enslaved to it in this way, that like we want to just say, well, it's just online, it doesn't matter, but it does matter, and it makes and breaks careers. It you could find the love of your life. It's the Wild West, and I think that's really scary.
Yeah, there is kind of this coping element to people wanting so badly to believe that the world isn't impacted nearly as much. The whole thing with Twitter is not real life, but the ideas, Twitter is not exactly real life. I mean, there's some evidence when you look at like, how Joe Biden was elected, and he obviously was not very popular on Twitter, at least among the people I'm following on Twitter. And the same thing with Eric Adams in New York. But I mean, at the end of the day, the ideas that are proliferating on social media and incubating on social media, whether it's Tumblr, Twitter, or TikTok, they are becoming incredibly influential. And I'm not just talking about woke. I'm talking about, to some extent, sexual liberation. I mean, when I'm flipping through TikTok, it's gotten better, probably because my recommendations on TikTok have sorted this out. But when I first went on TikTok, there were a lot of teenagers in bikinis, which made me very uncomfortable. And then I think my recommendations kind of kicked in, and I haven't had too much of a problem with that lately. But it's that's just another example of just like what it's doing to young girls and how it's making them view their bodies. I mean, this has been talked about ad nauseum. I mean, starting with Instagram, but to deny that does have, at this point, I consider it to be kind of a silly thing when people are like, Twitter, the internet is not real life. I think there's a healthy version of that where you're saying that there are other things to pay attention to. There are things that you can insulate from the internet. You can, build something outside of the internet, start a family, do these wonderful things that aren't dependent on the internet. But to say that it's not an incredibly influential part of our culture, or any individual aspect of it like TikTok, it just strikes me as it every single time it happens, it's like doomed to end up being just a take that ages incredibly poorly, because people have been wrong time and time again. Whether it's YouTube or streaming, video game streaming has become this huge thing where even I, as a gamer, I mean, there's my Zelda poster in the background. I was always like, no one's ever going to pay me to play video games. And then lo and behold, that became this huge thing. Those kind of like boomer takes, I mean, they kind of sound like boomer takes of like, no one's ever going to pay you. This is never going to have any influence. This is never going to matter. They always age so poorly. I've never seen it be the other way around, where, one of these things actually does disappear and end up being so ephemeral.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of that, the other piece is, it's really hard, try as you might, it is really hard to like relate to youth culture once you reach a certain age. I think some people have been able to transcend that. There, like, again, there are certain journalists where like maybe they're not holistically great journalists, but what they are really good at is not like they must see themselves as younger than they are or something, because they don't have that sort of myopia that tends to set in. I think there's like people who might feel threatened by new tech or certain new technologies or new social dynamics might be quick to dismiss it too, because they don't realize how quickly things are changing. Sort of tangentially related to this, there's this idea that's circulated on Twitter and is now sort of becoming mainstream, that culture is stuck. That culture kind of started to wind down around 2007, and like the pivotal years are 2004 to 2007. But I mean, that's not true. That's the kind of theory that someone who's in their late 30s or early 40s might put forth, and it sounds the same as like like a boomer or silent generation grandparent saying that like the last good music was produced in 1979. It's just not true. It's only true if you stopped paying attention, because you become sort of blind to the way culture evolves. And it's a talent to continue to be able to trend forecast both with tech and with culture, because you reach an age and you become disconnected. And I think one cool thing about technology is it helps like augment that in a way where you don't, if you put in a little bit more effort, you don't have to be disconnected. You can keep paying attention and your age can be veiled because you could just lurk. You could just lurk TikTok or lurk Twitter, and they don't have to know that you're like a 40-year-old who's just trying to keep up. Whereas, in the 70s, you'd be stuck with your physical form.
Yeah, this idea of what's going on with our culture and like, do we have a culture anymore is very interesting to me. And I'm glad you brought it up. I'm finally getting to an age, being in my like mid to late 20s, where I'm just starting to feel that like, am I just becoming like an out of touch, like older dude? And that'll happen sooner or later at some point. But I feel like I've done a pretty good job, especially being on TikTok and not just dismissing it. But this idea of the culture kind of winding down, it's interesting that people say 2007. I would have thought it was like slightly later. But in any case, I can see where they're coming from insofar that there are ways in which we have become so much less unified as a culture, particularly if you're looking at political polarization. It does seem like things that were just generally agreed upon for like decades, if not centuries, very quickly became like very contentious topics. But in terms of youth culture, definitely it comes off to me as kind of, like you said, an out of touch, ignorant statement, because go on TikTok, there's a sort of, there's the nihilistic meme oriented sense of humor that is incredibly unique to younger millennials and Gen Z people. There are different fashion trends. There are music trends. There are so many things. To imply that there's no culture, that culture is stuck, is to imply that there's no difference between generations, which is obviously not true.
Yeah, and I mean, like, even drill it down a little bit, a little bit further, like there's like, oh, so you time travel back to 2008 and you bring that person back to 2021, like their fashion wouldn't differentiate them, and that's not true either. If you really pay attention, like you could spot if an outfit is from 2001, 2008, 2015, and then today. It's more subtle maybe, or it's more subtle to our eye because we've been living it in one sort of fluid moment, and we're not like looking back just yet. But by 2030, I think it'll be like very, very clear, like, yes, there was a 2021 aesthetic, and there was a 2005, like all of these years have their own sort of flavor to them. It's just, I think maybe people are trying to move too quickly in trying to analyze it or something.
Yeah, I think to sort of play devil's advocate, you could say that like there is something about the quantity of truly universal experiences, i.e., a TV show that everyone likes, a movie that everyone likes. And this sort of tags on to the political polarization concept. There, especially now that Game of Thrones is off the air, and it seems like the only movies that everyone is watching are like superhero movies, which I'm just not a fan of. I've seen like two of them since like Iron Man or whatever. But it does seem like maybe when people say that culture is stuck, it's really just a way of them saying that they don't like new culture, which I can sympathize with, certainly in terms of film, because as I was saying, like superhero movies, I'm just so incredibly uninterested in. Like I can't even express. Like they just suck the life out of me with how boring they are at this point. But of course, Endgame was like one of the few movies that like everybody saw. And Game of Thrones was maybe the last TV show that will be like kind of this event. It seems like we're missing some of those culturally unifying events, or like, because like we don't even all watch the Oscars anymore, right? That's gone. We don't all watch the Super Bowl anymore. Those ratings are plummeting. It seems like these sort of shared experiences maybe are, to play devil's advocate, something that is going by the wayside.
But maybe also it's just that those things are changing. Like, there's this argument that there's no counterculture. And, like what I think of is like, it's not that there's no counterculture, or even in a sense that there's more censorship. It's just that the signifiers have changed and it's kind of disorienting. Like, think about it, like the man, quote unquote, and like the adults are sort of adopting this like millennial flavor progressivism. And then you have like the most mainstream young people are like a slightly more extreme version of that. And it's like, it's kind of like the same as like, it's like that, 40 years ago, that would have been something more conservative, but like the actual underlying dynamic is the same. And then the counterculture is, I think, like people we see on like right-wing Twitter, you know, who are sort of going against what's now like the accepted class. And like there's a spectrum of that. So, you know, to go back to like the Oscars example, it's like people don't watch the Oscars, but there are other things that unite us. For example, like songs on TikTok. Like even if you're not on TikTok, like you recognize, and like you might not even quite know why that song sounds familiar to you, but it sounds familiar. And there's tons of examples like this. It's just, I think we haven't realized that these legacy institutions or legacy events have kind of dwindled down, and there's been something new in its stead. Like to say culture is stuck, or to say it's, you know, somehow over, would imply that we're all kind of paying attention to different things and we're all on a different page, and there's not stuff that like we all kind of know about. That's not true. Like everyone knows who Joe Rogan is, everyone knows who Alex Jones is, everyone knows what Call Her Daddy is. I mean, there's like a bunch of stuff that's like, you know, in the public consciousness. It's just not the recognizable brands like the Oscars or the Super Bowl.
Yeah, and there's an element to this where I guess when you really think about it, nothing can last forever. I mean, the NFL has been doing the Super Bowl since what, like 1962 or something. I mean, like things, inevitably everything comes to an end. I mean, it's just like the nature of things. I mean, the Oscars weren't always going to be interesting because there was kind of a flimsy concept. I mean, it's taking the subjective world of art and film and saying we're going to attach value to it via these awards. And people just kind of don't care anymore. It seems like even celebrity culture in general, like who the hell cares who the AAA list of highest paid actors is anymore? People want to know who's the most followed on TikTok, which is a similar part of your brain, right? It's the who has the most X, but it's just kind of a different version of that. And of course, I guess my point is saying, like, of course these things were going to change. I guess for people to be so shocked by it that like the Oscars and the Super Bowl aren't unifying events anymore, it's like, how long did you think that was going to last? 200, 300 years? I mean, it's not that entertaining. I like football, but like, you know?
Yeah, and I think it's like stuff changes so quickly too that you sort of get whiplash, especially the, you know, like I would say like millennials, and then, you know, people who are in between Gen X and millennials who have like a really firm, you know, consciousness in sort of the pre-social media world. It feels very like disorienting. But I think what people miss is like, this is progress. It's just not the progress you wanted. And it's not that there's nothing there. It's that you're still looking to the old things that just don't exist anymore. I mean, I feel like this is sort of an argument I get in with a close friend of mine all the time. She's very analog, and like she's not very tech savvy, and this isn't a flaw of hers at all. I mean, she's a very bright and interesting person, but she's like, well, nobody cares about tech. Nobody really knows about this stuff. And sometimes I just want to tell her, like, no, everybody knows about it. You are stuck behind, and that doesn't mean what you like or what you're interested in is wrong or bad, or, you know, you have bad taste or anything. It's just, yeah, things changed, and it takes a lot of effort to keep up, and who could blame someone for not keeping up? But then, you know, the flip side, she's like right on the cusp of Gen X and millennials. So like, why would she have, you know what I mean? Like, of course she's sort of staying with what's familiar.
Yeah, it is incredibly disorienting, even for me. I mean, I think I'm on being born in 95. I think I'm literally like the exact year that separates young millennials from older Gen Z, or maybe it's 96, but I would generally identify, I would say I'm probably a younger millennial. And so I came up like up until I was around 10 was when like social media really starts to explode. Is like 2005, you're getting like YouTube, Facebook is growing, all of that. And it definitely has moved, I think, too quickly for our society to sort of effectively adjust to it. And we're seeing those growing pains in like really obvious ways, but it doesn't feel like we have a leadership class that is capable of addressing the pain that is being caused and the destruction that is being caused, when some of the solutions seem fairly obvious. And then even worse, our leadership class seems to be just exacerbating the situation. I mean, I think of the censorship that is going on in a lot of spaces on social media as like, that is so unnecessary. Like the fact that Meghan Murphy was kicked off Twitter for saying that men can't be women just strikes me as like, that it is so easy not to do that during this time where we're like really struggling to figure this thing out, and where it is so disorienting to all of us. And I'm worried about whether or not we really are making progress, because I just see so much destruction, and I see our leadership class being completely incapable of adjusting us to this thing and helping us out.
You know, so I agree with most of that. You know, a lot of this stuff is really worrisome. But the one thing I feel, and this actually might reveal one of my blind spots, or you know, a lack of historical knowledge on my part, but it feels like, you know, careers would be ended and people would be sort of like socially disappeared, and you know, shows would be pulled off the air for crossing these sort of social boundaries. Like one really low hanging fruit example is Sinead O'Connor when she was on SNL and she called the
Right.
Pope out for being, you know, for enabling pedophilia. I mean, that ruined her career. She wasn't that, you know, that episode, you know, I'm pretty sure like they ended the episode after she did that. Like there was all sorts of things. And you know, there's other examples, like women who were revealed as being like, you know, quote unquote sluts or whatever, like their reputation tarnished, and like the TV show they starred in was canceled, and like they don't get hired again. Like this is all in a sense the same censorship we're seeing on like the more like micro level. Teachers getting fired because someone assumes they're gay, magazines no longer being sold, books being banned, so on and so forth. It's just like, again, it's like presenting somewhat differently. So it's hard for us. We're like, oh, this is new, but I don't think it's new. I think it's just the values that we use to dictate it are one, different, and two, it's digital instead of on TV or in publishing. So it feels a little bit, it feels somehow like a different beast when it's the same, you know, the same problem that we've been dealing with forever. And that's why the counterculture is more conservative, and why it's, let me preface this with saying that I myself am not transphobic and I don't support anti-trans rhetoric. However, like it does make sense why a counterculture that is, you know, transphobic or anti-trans would emerge, because it's such a touchy thing. I mean, it used to be you couldn't talk about sex, and now you could talk about sex. So it becomes, you know, it becomes punk to be sex negative. And I think that's what I feel like I'm constantly beating a dead horse here. And this is the thing I say over and over and over again. But I think really that's a big part of it.
Yeah, I think the historical perspective that you bring is a very good point and is very important. I have thought about this myself, how, I mean, if you're talking about censorship and what was acceptable in the Overton window, I mean, at one point, the abolition of slavery was something that could get you fired from your job if you advocated for it. Obviously, this is 200 years ago, but that was like there have always been things which would seem self-evident to a reasonable person by today's standards, which, you know, were borderline illegal to say. Especially if you want to go back thousands of years, you could be executed for any number of words, you know, and so censorship, and very extreme forms of censorship have existed for eons. And I mean, I think a lot of people lack historical perspective on this. I mean, when we look at world history, as recently as 1945, we were embroiled in a potentially world-ending conflict. As recently as maybe the 60s, if you count the Cold War. The world has certainly been in rough shape before. I think that the internet presents itself as such a unpredictable and massive overhaul of humanity. Like it's like this huge update. Like if it's a video game, it's like this update that just changes the whole game, and it changes our psychology. It's changing the way our brains work. That it certainly makes me very uneasy, especially when I think about the impacts it's having on me, the impacts it's having on the people around me, on my leaders. It's certainly, it has sped up the speed at which we live life and at the speed at which things change. And I don't know if we as a species can live at that speed. And I guess there's sort of this, I don't mean to get like apocalyptic here, but I just wonder if we're like heading towards some kind of grand finale, because I don't know what comes after the internet. Like what is going to happen now that we're moving at like 1,000,000 miles an hour?
It's a good question. And I mean, the other piece of this that it's one of these issues that has become hard to talk about because it's been so, I guess, just like ruined with misinformation and, you know, political jargon and stuff. But like climate change is also another piece of this. Like we're going to have climate refugees. We already do. And you have a counterculture that says it's cringe to believe in climate change because yes, it has been weaponized by the left. The right has sort of mixed opinions on it. Like either you have climate deniers and then you have people who are, you know, really hard environmentalists, but they have, you know, sort of a suite of, you know, problematic beliefs. So it's kind of hard to get behind them. And there's all sorts of, you know, commenting of techno optimists. You have all sorts of people, you know, pushing their own theory. And I feel like, you know, in all this noise, we haven't really talked about like, well, what are we going to do? And, you know, what's the impact there? I feel like this is sort of the elephant in the room that we all kind of know about, and like no one's really moving on it. You have some like cool climate tech companies, but, you know, as far as I know, like, you know, nothing really with enough momentum to help, but, you know, help get us out of this mess or to make a real dent. You know, I mean, there's tons of problems that I feel like are totally eclipsed by a lot of culture war stuff. You know, I don't know much about this, but it seems like very interesting to me. Like you have a lot of very, very rich people from other parts of the world, like particularly China, but not just China, buying a lot of real estate up north and buying so much real estate in some countries that they're practically colonizing it. When you factor that in with climate change, like what does that mean? What does it mean that like it might, you know, wildfires might engulf the Pacific Northwest, and then they really can't move further north because all, you know, they've been priced out of all of those, you know, of all of those apartments and homes. Like, I mean, I feel like there's a whole bunch of things going on that we're not really thinking about. What does it mean that, you know, the permafrost is melting in Siberia and they're finding new viruses? What actually happened with COVID? There's all sorts of issues.
Yeah, and it seems like more than ever we're distracted. I mean, there's more to think about than ever before. Like anyone can access almost any piece of information or go down any rabbit hole, which is endlessly entertaining or fascinating. And so, like, I believe in climate change because I've done like a cursory, you know, read through of the science on it. But I'll be honest, I don't know that much about it. I recycle. That's about as much as I do, I guess. But it's like we're definitely in an age where it seems like we have more sort of like a potentially apocalyptic occurrences arising and less attention span to deal with them. Although at the same time, we have better and better technology. One note of optimism, I think about how like the nuclear weapons thing more or less seems to have been taken care of. Like it was like really scary for a while. We called that the Cold War, and then we kind of got a grip on it.
Yeah, I actually don't know much about it. I mean, I don't know much about anything really, but it just feels like there's a lot of there's so much going on in the world, and it seems like 99.9% of the discussions I hear are about, you know, transgender 14-year-olds, and it's like, okay, sure, but like, you know,
Yeah,
there's
the culture war stuff, it is so hard to ignore because I'm totally guilty of this. I mean, my channel, I cover this stuff a lot just because I am very emotionally invested in it, and I do genuinely think that stuff is important. I think the discussion around you know, what it means to be male or female, around what it means to be masculine or feminine, but around race relations is impossible to ignore, and yet it does make, I think, a lot of people turn a blind eye to what could possibly be bigger issues.
Yeah, I don't mean to sound dismissive because obviously I have a lot of skin in the game with like more culture war related topics as well. Like, you know, it's all I write about. I'm not exactly like writing about climate refugees, and I don't even really know enough about it to speak intelligently on it. But yeah, it does seem like there's a whole bunch of things happening, and we I mean, maybe the solution is that they aren't two separate issues. It's all one issue that, you know, we struggle to grapple with just because of the weight. It's just too overwhelming to put all the pieces together.
Yeah, it is a lot. And it's so much we could probably talk about it for like several more hours, but I know we blocked out an hour to chat today and I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know you've got lots to do. But I want to just say thanks for coming on the show, Default Friend, and give you an opportunity real quick. Go ahead and let people know about your podcast, your Twitter, anything else you want to plug or promote today before we sign off.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks so much for having me on. And if people want to follow me on Twitter, I'm default_friend, and on Substack, I'm defaultfriend.substack.com. And there you could find all my writing and my podcast After the Orgy, which I co-host with the Personality Girl.
All right, everybody, check that stuff out. I will personally recommend After the Orgy. I've listened to about half a dozen episodes. Really cool show. Lots of interesting discussions there. And yeah, we're going to sign off in a minute here. But real quick, if you're listening to the show on iTunes, please give us a 5-star review. It really, really helps the show get out to more people. And if you're listening on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe. I'd love to hear from you guys what you thought of today's discussion. And with that, I'll see you guys next time on the Veritas podcast.